Have you ever looked at an old photograph and felt something was wrong? Today, we're diving into one of the most chilling images ever captured aboard the RMS Titanic. A seemingly innocent portrait of a young couple in first class hides something that has haunted historians and paranormal researchers for over a century. What you're about to discover might change how you see historical photographs forever. If you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to mention that I'm also developing another channel where I explore even more mysterious stories like this one. If you're interested in diving deeper into the unknown, check it out in the description below. Now, let's uncover what really lurks in the shadows of this fateful photograph. The morning of April 10th, 1912, dawned crisp and clear over Southampton, England. The harbour buzzed with unprecedented excitement as the world's largest moving object prepared for its maiden voyage. The RMS Titanic stood at the dock like a floating palace, its four massive funnels piercing the spring sky, promising an era of luxury and technological triumph that would redefine ocean travel forever. Among the 2,224 souls boarding that day were Thomas and Eleanor Ashworth, a young American couple from Philadelphia's elite society. Thomas, 28, had inherited his family's textile fortune just 2 years prior, while Eleanor, 25, came from old money, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. Their marriage 6 months earlier had been the social event of the season, and this transatlantic journey was their delayed honeymoon, a celebration of love and prosperity. Eleanor stepped onto the gangway, wearing a powder blue traveling suit trimmed with Belgian lace, her auburn hair perfectly coiffed beneath a wide-brimmed hat adorned with ostrich feathers. Thomas walked beside her in a charcoal morning coat, his hand resting protectively on the small of her back. To onlookers, they embodied everything the Titanic represented: youth, wealth, and boundless optimism about the future. Their stateroom on B-deck exceeded even Eleanor's considerable expectations. Mahogany paneling gleamed in the electric light, a luxury still novel enough to inspire wonder. The room featured a four-poster bed with silk curtains, a private bathroom with heated towel rails, and a sitting area with plush velvet furniture. Through the porthole, Eleanor could see the English coast slowly receding as the mighty ship began its journey. "Can you imagine, darling?" Thomas said, wrapping his arms around his wife from behind as they gazed out at the sea. "In just 5 days we'll be in New York. 5 days! It took my grandfather nearly 3 weeks to make this crossing." Eleanor leaned back against him, but something made her shiver despite the warmth of the room. "It's magnificent," she agreed, though her voice carried a tremor she couldn't quite explain. "Almost too magnificent, as if we're tempting fate somehow." Thomas laughed, kissing the top of her head. "That's just superstition talking. This ship is unsinkable. The newspapers said so. We're riding the future, Eleanor." That afternoon, as the Titanic cruised smoothly through calm waters toward Cherbourg, France, the couple decided to explore the ship's legendary amenities. They strolled through the first-class dining saloon, a room so grand it could have served as a state ballroom, with its ornate plasterwork ceiling and crystal chandeliers. They marveled at the Turkish baths, the swimming pool, the squash court, and the gymnasium with its electric horse and camel. On the boat deck, the highest point accessible to passengers, they encountered a professional photographer named Henry Aldridge. He had been commissioned by White Star Line to document the maiden voyage, capturing images that would be used for publicity once they reached New York. "Pardon me," Aldridge called out, his Cockney accent thick but friendly. "You two make a striking pair. Would you mind terribly if I took your photograph? The light is perfect just now, and you represent exactly what this voyage is about: young love and new beginnings." Eleanor hesitated, that same unexplained unease washing over her again. But Thomas was already agreeing enthusiastically, positioning them near the railing with the ship's massive funnels creating a dramatic backdrop. "Stand close together," Aldridge instructed, peering through his large-format camera mounted on a wooden tripod. "That's perfect. Mr. Ashworth, your hand on your wife's shoulder. Mrs. Ashworth, a slight smile if you please. You're on the adventure of a lifetime." Eleanor forced herself to smile, though the chill she felt had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. As Aldridge counted down and the camera's shutter clicked, she could have sworn she felt someone watching them from behind. The sensation was so strong that the moment the photograph was taken, she spun around. "What is it?" Thomas asked, concerned by the sudden pallor of her face. I thought someone was standing behind us," Eleanor whispered. "Very close. I felt their breath on my neck." They both looked around, but the deck was nearly empty. Only an elderly couple sat in deck chairs 30 feet away, and 2 stewards stood at attention near the entrance to the grand staircase. No one had been anywhere near them. "Just nerves," Thomas assured her, though he felt unsettled by her reaction. "Come, let's dress for dinner. I hear the first-class dining experience is something to behold. If you're enjoying this story so far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps me continue bringing you these mysterious tales." That evening, the Ashworths dined on oysters, consommé, filet mignon, and chocolate eclairs in the first-class dining saloon. Around them, the cream of society laughed and conversed. John Jacob Astor IV with his young pregnant wife, the wealthy widow Margaret Brown, the industrialist Benjamin Guggenheim. The orchestra played Puccini and Strauss, while stewards in crisp white jackets attended to every need. Yet Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that had gripped her on deck. Throughout dinner, she found her eyes drawn to the shadows between the pillars, to the darkened corners where the electric lights didn't quite reach. Once, she could have sworn she saw a figure standing perfectly still among the other diners, watching her with eyes that held neither warmth nor mercy. "Eleanor, you've barely touched your food," Thomas noted. "Are you feeling unwell?" "I'm fine," she lied, taking a sip of champagne. "Perhaps just tired from the excitement of the day." Bye. But when they returned to their stateroom that night, Eleanor stood at the porthole for a long time, staring out at the black Atlantic waters. Somewhere in the darkness she sensed something was waiting, something that had been waiting for a very long time and had finally found what it was looking for. In her diary that night she wrote, "There is something wrong with this ship, though I cannot say what. Thomas thinks I'm being foolish, and perhaps I am. But I feel as though we are all players in a drama whose ending has already been written. God help us all." 3 days into the voyage, the Titanic had settled into a comfortable rhythm. The initial excitement of boarding had given way to the pleasant routine of luxurious leisure. Passengers spent their mornings promenading on deck, their afternoons in the reading rooms and smoking lounges, and their evenings in elaborate 7-course dinners, followed by entertainment in the first-class lounge. Thomas Ashworth had made several acquaintances among the other first-class gentlemen. He spent hours in the smoking room discussing business and politics with millionaire industrialists and European nobility. Eleanor, meanwhile, found the constant socializing exhausting. She preferred quiet moments in the ship's library or solitary walks on the less crowded sections of deck. It was during one of these walks, on the afternoon of April 13th, that Eleanor encountered Henry Aldridge again. The photographer was packing up his equipment after what appeared to be a long session documenting the ship's grand staircase. "Mrs. Ashworth," he called out cheerfully. "Perfect timing. I've just finished developing the photographs from our first day aboard, including the lovely portrait of you and your husband. Would you care to see it?" Eleanor's immediate instinct was to decline, but curiosity overcame her reluctance. She followed Aldridge to a small workspace he'd been provided near the third-class general room, where he'd set up a makeshift darkroom. The photograph lay on a table, still damp from the developing process. Eleanor gasped when she saw it. The image was technically perfect. She and Thomas looked radiant, the very picture of privileged youth against the magnificent backdrop of the ship's superstructure. But something was terribly, undeniably wrong. Behind them, barely visible in the shadows cast by the ship's massive funnels, stood a figure. It was indistinct, as if slightly out of focus or partially transparent, but unmistakably present. The figure appeared to be a man in dark clothing, though his features were impossible to make out clearly. What was clear, however, were his eyes, 2 points of pale luminescence that seemed to bore directly into the camera, directly at Eleanor herself. "What? What is that?" Eleanor breathed, her hand trembling as she pointed at the shadow figure. Aldridge leaned in, squinting. "What is what, ma'am?" That figure behind us, that man!" The photographer studied the photograph more carefully, then shook his head. "I'm afraid I don't see anyone, Mrs. Ashworth. Perhaps you're referring to a shadow. The lighting conditions on deck can create unusual effects, especially with the smoke from the funnels." "You don't see him?" Eleanor's voice rose in pitch. "He's right there. He's looking at us, at me." Aldridge's expression shifted from confusion to concern. "Ma'am, I assure you there's nothing in this photograph except you, your husband, and the ship itself. Perhaps you should sit down. The motion of the sea can affect some people's—" But Eleanor had already grabbed the photograph and fled, her heart pounding so violently she thought it might burst from her chest. She ran through the corridors, desperate to find Thomas, to make him see what she had seen. She found him in the smoking room, in the middle of a poker game with 3 other gentlemen. His face lit up when he saw her, then immediately darkened when he noticed her distress. "Eleanor, what's wrong?" He excused himself from the game and guided her to a private corner. She thrust the photograph at him with shaking hands. "Look at this. Tell me you see it too." Thomas examined the image carefully. For a long moment he said nothing, and Eleanor's heart soared with hope that he would validate her terror. But when he looked up, his expression was one of gentle concern mixed with embarrassment. "Darling, it's a lovely photograph. We look quite handsome together." "Behind us, Thomas. The figure behind us." He looked again, more carefully this time. "I see some shadows from the funnels, perhaps a trick of the light. But Eleanor, there's no one there." The photographer said the deck was clear, except for those people far in the background. "But I can see him. He's right there, staring at us with those horrible eyes." Leave a comment below about what you think this story means so far. I love hearing your theories. Thomas took her hands in his voice dropping to a whisper. "Eleanor, you're causing a scene. Everyone is looking at us." Indeed, several gentlemen had paused their conversations to observe the disturbance. Eleanor felt heat rising to her cheeks, shame mixing with terror and frustration. "I'm not imagining this," she insisted, though her voice had lost its strength. "I know you believe you see something," Thomas said carefully. "But perhaps the voyage has been more stressful than we anticipated. Why don't you return to our cabin and rest? I'll have the steward bring you some tea and perhaps a sedative. You'll feel better after some sleep." Eleanor wanted to argue, to make him understand, but the looks from the other passengers, pitying, uncomfortable, even amused, made her feel suddenly exposed and foolish. Perhaps she was losing her mind. Perhaps there was nothing in the photograph at all. "Yes," she said quietly, "perhaps you're right." Back in their stateroom, Eleanor lay on the bed and stared at the photograph. The figure was still there, as clear as day to her eyes. But if no one else could see it, what did that mean? Was she experiencing some kind of breakdown? Her grandmother had spent her final years in an asylum, seeing things that weren't there, speaking to people who had died long ago. Was that same madness now claiming Eleanor? She drifted into an uneasy sleep and dreamed of cold water and screaming, of people clawing at each other in darkness, of that shadow figure walking slowly through corridors that seemed to stretch into infinity, getting closer and closer to her door. When she woke, it was dark outside, and Thomas still hadn't returned. The photograph lay on the bedside table where she'd left it. In the dim electric light, the shadow figure seemed even more pronounced, more present. And as Eleanor stared at it, she could have sworn its eyes moved, tracking her as she sat up in bed. A knock at the door made her jump. A steward entered with a supper tray, apologizing for the late hour. "Mr. Ashworth asked me to bring this to you, ma'am. He's been detained in the smoking room. They've started quite the high-stakes game, apparently. He says he'll be along shortly." After the steward left, Eleanor picked at the cold roast beef and potatoes, but she had no appetite. She kept the photograph face down, unable to look at it, yet unable to destroy it. It was evidence, she told herself, evidence that she wasn't mad, even if no one else could see what she saw. Around 11 o'clock, Thomas finally returned, smelling of cigars and brandy, his face flushed with alcohol and winning. "Darling, you should have seen it. I walked away with nearly 300 pounds. He noticed her pale face and felt immediate guilt. "But never mind that. How are you feeling? Better?" "The figure in the photograph," Eleanor said quietly. "You truly don't see it?" Thomas's expression fell. "Eleanor, please, let's not just answer me. Do you see anything behind us in that photograph? Anything at all that shouldn't be there?" He sighed and picked up the image, studying it once more in the electric light. This time, something made him pause. Perhaps it was the quality of the light, or perhaps he was simply looking more carefully, wanting desperately to see what his wife saw. For just a moment, he thought he detected something, a shape that might have been a figure, a pattern in the shadows that suggested a face. But then it was gone, and he convinced himself it had been his imagination, spurred by Eleanor's insistence and his own guilt for dismissing her concerns. "I see shadows," he said finally. "Nothing more." Eleanor nodded slowly and said nothing. She understood now that she was alone in this, that whatever haunted that photograph, whatever had attached itself to them on that sunny afternoon on deck, only she could see it. And that terrified her more than anything else could have. That night, as Thomas snored beside her, Eleanor lay awake, listening to the sounds of the great ship cutting through the Atlantic darkness. The engines hummed their constant rhythm, the woodwork creaked, and somewhere far below, she imagined she could hear water dripping, dripping, dripping. She didn't know then that she had less than 24 hours left to live. None of them did. But somewhere in the darkness, something new, something that had been waiting for this moment, for this ship, for these particular souls to gather in one place where there would be no escape. The shadow in the photograph knew, and it was patient. April 14th, 1912, dawned clear and cold. The temperature had dropped significantly overnight, and passengers who ventured onto deck before breakfast found a sharp bite in the air that suggested they were sailing through waters far more northern than any had expected. Eleanor Ashworth had barely slept. When she finally dragged herself from bed around 8 o'clock, Thomas had already left their stateroom, leaving a note saying he'd gone to breakfast with some of his new acquaintances. She was grateful for his absence. She needed time to think, to decide what to do about the photograph that still lay face down on her nightstand. She dressed slowly, choosing a simple day dress of dark green wool, and made her way to the first-class dining saloon. The room was less crowded than usual. Many passengers were sleeping late after the previous night's entertainment. Eleanor ordered only tea and toast and sat near a window overlooking the endless expanse of grey-blue ocean. "May I join you?" Eleanor looked up to find an older woman standing beside her table. She appeared to be in her 60s, with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes that seemed to look right through Eleanor. There was something about her bearing that suggested both wealth and a kind of wisdom that came from experience rather than education. "Of course," Eleanor said, gesturing to the empty chair. The woman sat down and introduced herself as Mrs. Catherine Hayes, traveling alone to New York to visit her son and his family. For several minutes, they exchanged the usual pleasantries about the voyage, the ship, the weather. But then Mrs. Hayes leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "You saw something, didn't you? Something the others can't see." Eleanor's teacup clattered against its saucer. I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do. I saw you yesterday with that photograph, the distress on your face. Your husband couldn't see it, could he? Neither could the photographer. How do you... Because I've seen it too, Mrs. Hayes interrupted quietly. Not in a photograph, but I've seen him. The shadow man. He's been on this ship since we left Southampton, watching, waiting. Eleanor felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath her. You've seen him? Then I'm not going mad? No, child, you're not mad, though I wish you were. It would be easier to bear. Mrs. Hayes pulled a small journal from her handbag and opened it to a page filled with neat handwriting. I've been keeping a record. He appears in different places at different times, always in shadows, always watching. I've seen him in the corridors late at night, in the reflection of mirrors. Once, I saw him standing at the foot of the grand staircase, perfectly still, while hundreds of people passed by without noticing him. But who is he? What does he want? Mrs. Hayes closed her journal slowly. I spent 3 days trying to answer that question. At first, I thought he might be a ghost, a spirit trapped on the ship somehow. But that doesn't feel right. He doesn't feel like something dead. He feels like something expectant, like he's waiting for something specific to happen. If you're still with me, hit that like button and subscribe. This story is about to get even more intense. What could he be waiting for? Eleanor whispered, though something cold was settling in her stomach, a knowing that she didn't want to acknowledge. Mrs. Hayes looked out at the ocean for a long moment before answering. Have you noticed how cold it's gotten? How the crew seems more tense than they did yesterday? I've made this crossing 7 times, Mrs. Ashworth. I know these waters. We're in ice territory now. Ice? But the ship is unsinkable. Everyone says so. Everyone said the Titanic would reach New York in record time too. Everyone says a great many things. Mrs. Hayes reached across the table and took Eleanor's hand. I don't know what that shadow figure is or what it wants. But I know that it's connected to this ship, to this voyage, and I know that we're all in danger. I can feel it in my bones. Eleanor wanted to dismiss the older woman's words as paranoid fantasy, but she couldn't. Everything Mrs. Hayes said resonated with her own unexpressed fears. What should we do? Eleanor asked. Stay alert. Stay close to the lifeboats. And most importantly, don't let anyone convince you that what you're seeing isn't real. Trust your instincts, even when others doubt you. The 2 women parted shortly after breakfast, but Eleanor felt less alone than she had since boarding the ship. At least one other person understood. One other person could see what lurked in the shadows of this magnificent vessel. She found Thomas on the boat deck, chatting with John Jacob Astor. When he saw her, he excused himself and came over, his expression cautiously optimistic. You look better, he observed, more rested. Thomas, I need you to listen to me. Really listen, without dismissing what I'm saying as female hysteria or nerves. His face tightened slightly, but he nodded. Go on. I'm not the only one who's seen strange things on this ship. There's another woman, Mrs. Hayes, and she's been seeing the same figure I saw in the photograph. She thinks we're in danger. Eleanor, please just hear me out. She says we're sailing through ice fields. She says the crew seems worried. Don't you notice how cold it's gotten? Don't you feel that something is wrong? Thomas took her hands, his expression a mix of love and frustration. Darling, I know you've been under a great deal of stress with the wedding and now this trip. But you must stop this. You're talking to strangers about shadows and danger, and people are starting to talk. I've already heard whispers that you might be unwell. So you'd rather I stay quiet and let people think I'm well, even if I'm right about the danger? There is no danger. This ship is the safest vessel ever built. The captain himself said we'll make excellent time to New York. Everything is fine, Eleanor. Everything is perfect. But his words rang hollow, and Eleanor realized with a sinking heart that Thomas would never believe her. He was too invested in the fantasy of their perfect honeymoon, their perfect life. He couldn't allow anything to threaten that carefully constructed dream. She spent the rest of the day wandering the ship, unable to settle anywhere. Several times she caught glimpses of the shadow figure, standing in a doorway, reflected in a window, at the end of a corridor. Each time she looked directly at it, it seemed to fade, but she knew it was still there, still watching, still waiting. That evening, she dressed for dinner in a gown of midnight blue silk, with diamonds at her throat and ears. Thomas looked dashing in his white tie and tails. To anyone watching, they were the perfect couple, living their best life aboard the most magnificent ship in the world. During dinner, Captain Smith stopped by their table to welcome them personally. He was jovial and confident, assuring everyone that they were making excellent progress and would arrive in New York ahead of schedule if conditions remained favorable. "What about the ice warnings?" Eleanor found herself asking before she could stop herself. Captain Smith's smile didn't waver, but something flickered in his eyes. "Standard precautions for this time of year, Mrs. Ashworth. Nothing to concern yourself with. We've received a few messages about ice in the area, but we're well south of the main fields. The Titanic can handle anything the Atlantic throws at us." After he left, Thomas gripped Eleanor's hand under the table, his fingers tight enough to hurt. "Please," he whispered, "no more." The orchestra played on, champagne flowed, people laughed and danced, and in the shadows between the pillars the shadow figure watched it all with those pale, luminous eyes. At 11:40 p.m., Eleanor was in their stateroom preparing for bed. Thomas had gone to the smoking room for one last brandy with his new friends. She stood at the porthole, looking out at the star-filled night, when she felt the ship shudder slightly. It wasn't much, just a subtle change in the rhythm of the engines, a faint grinding sound that most people would probably sleep through. But Eleanor knew, with absolute certainty, that something terrible had just happened. She grabbed her coat and rushed out into the corridor. Other passengers were beginning to emerge from their rooms, looking confused. A steward hurried past, his face pale. "What's happened?" Eleanor called out to him. "Nothing to worry about, Mom. Just a precaution. Please return to your cabin." But Eleanor didn't return to her cabin. Instead, she made her way up to the boat deck, her heart pounding. When she emerged into the freezing night air, she saw chunks of ice scattered across the deck like jewels. People were picking them up, laughing, making jokes about the ice delivery. And standing near the railing, perfectly still amidst all the confusion and laughter, was the shadow figure. This time, when Eleanor looked at it, it didn't fade. Instead, it turned its head slowly to face her directly. For the first time, she could see its face clearly. It wasn't human, not exactly. The features were there, but they were wrong somehow, as if someone had assembled a human face from memory rather than observation. But the eyes were perfectly clear, ancient, knowing, and utterly without mercy. In that moment, Eleanor understood. The figure wasn't waiting for something to happen. It had made something happen. It had brought them all here, to this place, to this moment. Every one of them aboard the Titanic had been chosen, had been led here like sheep to slaughter. The shadow figure smiled at her then, a terrible, triumphant smile, and vanished. Around her, passengers were starting to realize that something was genuinely wrong. The ship was listing slightly to starboard. Officers were beginning to uncover the lifeboats. And in the distance, Eleanor could hear Thomas calling her name, panic finally breaking through his carefully maintained facade of confidence. There were 2 hours and 40 minutes left before the Titanic would slip beneath the waves, taking 2,500 souls with it into the cold Atlantic darkness. And Eleanor Ashworth knew with absolute certainty that she would be one of them. The shadow in the photograph had known all along. The next hour passed in a chaos that Eleanor would remember in fragments for what remained of her life. Thomas found her on the boat deck, grabbed her arm so tightly it left bruises, and demanded to know why she'd left their cabin. She tried to explain about the collision, the ice, the shadow figure's terrible smile, but her words came out in a jumbled rush that he couldn't follow. "It doesn't matter now," he said, his voice shaking. "We need to get to the lifeboats. They're loading women and children first." As they pushed through the growing crowd on deck, Eleanor caught sight of Mrs. Hayes. The older woman stood near Lifeboat 7, her face eerily calm amidst the panic. When their eyes met, Mrs. Hayes nodded slowly, as if confirming something they both understood but could never explain. The ship's tilt was becoming more pronounced. Officers shouted instructions, trying to maintain order as passengers flooded onto the boat deck in various states of dress, some in furs and jewels, others in nightclothes and lifebelts hastily strapped on. The ship's orchestra had assembled near the grand staircase and began playing ragtime numbers, the cheerful music creating a surreal counterpoint to the growing panic. Thomas pushed Eleanor toward Lifeboat 6, where Officer Moody was calling for women and children. But Eleanor hesitated, looking back at her husband. In that moment, she saw their entire future, the children they would never have, the house they would never buy, the life they would never live. All of it erased in a single night. "I won't leave you," she said. "Don't be foolish." Thomas's voice cracked. "You have to go. I'll be on another boat. They'll have plenty for everyone once they realize how serious this is." But even as he said it, they both knew it was a lie. There weren't enough lifeboats. There had never been enough lifeboats. Someone had decided that all those extra boats would clutter the deck, would ruin the aesthetic of the ship's elegant profile. Someone had made a choice, and now 1,500 people would pay for it with their lives. Eleanor felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see Mrs. Hayes. "Get in the boat, child," the older woman said gently. "Your time hasn't come yet. Mine has, but yours hasn't." "What do you mean?" But Mrs. Hayes was already moving away, disappearing into the crowd before Eleanor could follow. An officer grabbed Eleanor's arm and practically lifted her into the lifeboat, which was only half full despite the desperate situation. Thomas reached through the crowd and gripped her hand one last time. "I love you," he said, and then he was gone, pushed back by the officers who were trying to maintain some semblance of order as the boat began to lower. Eleanor watched the Titanic from the lifeboat, and that's when she saw them. Dozens of shadow figures, perhaps hundreds, standing along the rails, on the deck, at every window. They were perfectly still, watching as the lifeboats pulled away, watching as the great ship began its final descent. And as Eleanor stared in horror, she realized that every single shadow figure was identical, the same dark clothing, the same pale eyes, the same inhuman face. They weren't ghosts. They weren't demons. They were something else entirely, something that had no name in any human language. They were witnesses, collectors, archivists of tragedy. They appeared wherever death came in massive, sudden quantities, drawn to such events like moths to flame. And they had known, perhaps for years or decades or centuries, that this ship would sink on this night in these waters. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think these shadow figures really are? The Titanic's bow was now fully submerged, and the stern was rising into the air at an impossible angle. The sound of breaking metal shrieked across the water as the ship's internal structure began to tear itself apart under the strain. Passengers still aboard clung to railings, jumped into the freezing water, scrambled toward the rising stern in a futile attempt to delay the inevitable. Eleanor could hear the screaming now, hundreds of voices rising in terror and despair. The orchestra was still playing impossibly, courageously, and she recognized the hymn, "Nearer, My God, to Thee." Then, at 2:20 a.m., the Titanic's lights flickered and went out, plunging 1,500 people into darkness. The final plunge took only moments. One instant the ship was there, a massive silhouette against the star-filled sky, and the next it was gone, swallowed by the black Atlantic. And in its place came a sound that Eleanor would hear in her nightmares for the rest of her life, the collective screaming and crying of hundreds of people dying in the freezing water. The shadow figures didn't go down with the ship. Instead, they rose into the air like dark smoke, hovering over the debris field where the Titanic had been. They circled slowly, methodically, as if cataloguing each death, each final moment. And then, as the screaming began to fade, not because people were being rescued, but because they were dying of hypothermia. The shadow figures began to disappear, winking out one by one like candles being extinguished. Eleanor's lifeboat drifted in the darkness for hours before the Carpathia arrived at dawn. Of the 65 people in her boat, 4 had died of exposure during the night. Eleanor had survived by wrapping herself in her fur coat and sharing body heat with other women, but she had felt death circling around them, patient and cold. When she was finally pulled aboard the Carpathia, wrapped in blankets and given hot coffee, she learned that Thomas was not among the survivors. Neither was Mrs. Hayes. Neither were most of the people she'd dined with, laughed with, danced with during those 4 days that now felt like a dream from someone else's life. The photograph survived. Eleanor found it in the pocket of her coat, somehow undamaged by the water and cold. The shadow figure was still there, clear as ever to her eyes, smiling that terrible smile. But now, there was something else in the image. Hundreds of tiny points of pale light scattered throughout the background, barely visible unless you knew to look for them. Each one was a shadow figure, each one a witness to the tragedy that had been inevitable from the moment the ship left Southampton. Eleanor never showed the photograph to anyone again. She kept it hidden in a locked box, unable to destroy it, but unwilling to let anyone else see what it contained. She remarried eventually, had 3 children, lived to be 87 years old, but she never forgot that night, and she never stopped seeing the shadow figures. They appeared throughout her life, always in the background, always watching. She saw them at her second wedding, at the births of her children, at the funerals of her parents. She saw them during World War I, during the Spanish flu pandemic, during World War II. Anywhere tragedy gathered, anywhere death came in numbers too large to comprehend, the shadow figures appeared. She tried to warn people once in 1937 before the Hindenburg disaster. She'd seen the shadow figures gathering around the airship, hundreds of them, and she'd tried to tell someone, anyone, that it was doomed. But just like Thomas aboard the Titanic, no one would listen. They thought she was a crazy old woman, traumatized by her experience on the Titanic and seeing danger everywhere. 72 hours later, the Hindenburg burst into flames, killing 36 people. And among the newsreel footage of the disaster, Eleanor could see them, the shadow figures circling the burning wreckage like dark angels, bearing witness to another tragedy they had known was coming all along. When Eleanor died in 1974, she left specific instructions that the photograph was to be destroyed without anyone viewing it. Her children, wanting to honor her final wishes, burned it without looking at it. But copies existed. The photographer Henry Aldridge had survived the Titanic and had kept the negatives of all his photographs from the voyage. Over the years, the image resurfaced occasionally in books about the Titanic, in museum exhibitions, in documentaries. Most people saw nothing unusual in it, just a young couple posing on the deck of a doomed ship, unaware that they had hours left to live. But some people, a very few people, saw what Eleanor had seen. They saw the shadow figure with its pale eyes and inhuman smile. They saw the hundreds of tiny lights in the background, each one a harbinger of doom. And they understood, as Eleanor had understood, that there are things in this world that exist beyond our comprehension, things that watch and wait and bear witness to our darkest moments. The Titanic's wreck was discovered in 1985, resting on the ocean floor in 2 pieces, slowly being consumed by rust and decay. Explorers have photographed it extensively, documenting the deterioration of what was once the most magnificent ship in the world. And in some of those photographs, if you look very carefully at the shadows and blurred areas, you can still see them. The shadow figures remain even now, more than a century later. They stand in the empty corridors, in the ruined staterooms, in the grand staircase where the orchestra played their last songs. They wait there still, in the cold darkness of the Atlantic, bearing witness to a tragedy that has never truly ended. Because the Titanic didn't just take 1,500 lives that night. It took dreams, futures, possibilities. It took children who would never be born, discoveries that would never be made, love stories that would never be completed. And the shadow figures remember them all. Eleanor Ashworth's diary, recovered from her estate after her death, contained one final entry dated April 14, 1974, exactly 62 years after the sinking. It read simply, "I saw them again today, in my mirror. They're waiting for me now, as they waited for us then. I understand at last. They don't cause these tragedies, they simply know. They exist in a space outside of time, where all moments happen simultaneously, where the past and future are the same. They saw the Titanic sink before it was even built. They saw me die before I was born. And now, finally, they've come to collect my story, to add it to their infinite archive of human suffering. I only hope that when I cross over, I'll see Thomas again. I'll tell him he was right about one thing. We did have an adventure, just not the one we expected." She died that night in her sleep, peacefully with a smile on her face. Her children reported that her room was unusually cold when they found her the next morning, and that there were strange shadows on the walls that didn't correspond to any furniture or objects in the room. The photograph may have been destroyed, but the image it captured lives on. It exists now in the realm of legend and mystery, discussed in forums and documentaries by people who believe in things that cannot be explained. Some say it was a hoax, a trick of the light and developing chemicals. Others say it was proof of something darker, something that lurks at the edges of human perception, waiting for moments of tragedy to manifest. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. The shadow figures are real, but they're not what we think they are. They're not ghosts or demons or alien observers. They're something far stranger and far more terrifying. They're mirrors. They reflect back to us our own mortality, our own fragility, our own inevitable doom. We don't see them because we can't bear to acknowledge what they represent, but sometimes, in old photographs, in the corners of mirrors, in the split second before disaster strikes, we catch a glimpse. We see the shadow figures watching us with their pale eyes, and we understand for just a moment that we are all passengers on a doomed ship, all sailing toward an ending we can sense but cannot prevent. The Titanic was just one ship, one tragedy, one night. But the shadow figures are everywhere, always, bearing witness to every ending, every loss, every moment when hope transforms into horror. They were there at Pompeii, at Hiroshima, at the World Trade Center. They'll be there at the next disaster, and the one after that, and the one after that. And somewhere, in the cold darkness at the bottom of the Atlantic, they still stand in the ruins of the Titanic, waiting for the day when the last piece of the ship finally dissolves into the sea. Only then will they move on, their vigil complete, their archive of that particular tragedy sealed forever. Until then, they remain, watching, waiting, remembering. The photograph is gone, but the truth it revealed will never die. Because once you've seen them, once you've looked into those pale, ancient eyes, you can never unsee them. They become part of your reality, part of your understanding of how the world truly works. Eleanor Ashworth knew this. Mrs. Catherine Hayes knew this. And now, perhaps, you know this too. Sleep well tonight if you can. But remember, the shadows in your room aren't always empty. Sometimes they're watching. Sometimes they're waiting. Sometimes they know things about your future that you don't. And sometimes, just sometimes, they smile. What do you think? Were these shadow figures witnesses to tragedy or something even more sinister? Could Eleanor really see beyond the veil that separates our world from whatever exists in the spaces between life and death? The truth is, we'll never know for certain. The photograph is gone, destroyed as Eleanor requested. The witnesses are all dead now. All that remains is the story, passed down through generations, growing stranger and more unsettling with each telling. If you enjoyed this exploration into one of the Titanic's most mysterious legends, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your theories about what those shadow figures might have been, or if you've ever experienced something similar in your own life. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now's the perfect time. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the next deep dive into history's most chilling mysteries. There are so many more stories waiting to be told, so many more shadows waiting to be explored. Until next time, keep questioning, keep wondering, and remember, sometimes the most terrifying truths are the ones hiding in plain sight, in old photographs, in forgotten diaries, in stories we dismiss as impossible. Because history isn't just what happened, it's also what we can't explain, what we can't quite see. What watches us from the shadows, bearing witness to our triumphs and our tragedies alike. Sweet dreams.